Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of AI Unleashed. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Nilema Bhakta-Jones. Nilema, would you like to say a few words and introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you, Ashwin. And thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Yes, I'm Nilema Bhakta-Jones. I'm the founder of Courageous Leaders, a business that works with teams and leaders actually to build a better world. And we have courage and creativity at the core of our mission. My background, very briefly, is I've had a 32-year career, 26 years in the law. And when I say in the law, I have various sectors and aspects of the law, from working for the government, working in private practice for international law firms, as well as working for big business. I've also had a 6-year career of which I was CEO of a startup business and also COO. And today I run this business. So we have 3 verticals. I coach and mentor. We also design offsites and workshops specifically with teams, leaders and teams. And we do that using creativity. We also use that doing adopting lots of different methodology based on a design for leaders and the outcome they want to achieve in the teams. And the third vertical is largely consultancy work, which is quite broad and interesting and certainly keeps me on my toes.
Yep, I'm in the same position, consultancy business, and it's always interesting having new problems to solve and new perspectives to deliver value. So I can imagine that's the most interesting thing about life, the universe, and everything. But
Yeah.
from what you've said,
Now more than ever, I think.
absolutely. Let's segue into the now. So from a few of the things that you mentioned, of course, leaders are coping with uncertainty. We have had 3 years of a trajectory of change that has been brought about by generative AI, by technology that's moving at a very rapid pace, and that leaders are either, in my experience, either coming to terms with, they could be unfamiliar with what's happening. They could be struggling to see a way forward. And sometimes they need to take a leap of faith with some assumptions, maybe not having a complete picture. And part of what we do, you and I both, in our consultancy space, is to try and demystify and try and provide evidence and, supporting analysis that helps some of these decisions to be made in a way that is less risky than just taking a leap of faith. So it requires a little bit of courage. It requires a little bit of evidence-based analysis, and it also requires strong leadership and vision. Reflecting on what you've seen in the last couple of years, how are companies and leaders specifically coping with not only the disruption that's happening, but the uncertainty that comes with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summarized it really well. When you and I met before, one of the things that struck a chord between us was that we both have seen leaders having to cope with a multitude of factors. And when we pan back and look at the macro perspective here, we pan back and we look at leaders having to deal with geopolitical disruption, political interference, actually, in certain businesses. And not just that, in the run-up and post-COVID, you've got leaders who are having to become experts in human behavior and understanding organizational behavioral factors in a way they've never had to before, because that kind of disruption didn't exist. So, they felt like they were getting on top of it. We saw more human-centered leadership because of the communication, the need to keep the morale up and productivity up. So those working at home, and we saw a change in communication. We saw leaders adopting social media more, which meant that they really had to think about their persona, how they talked about the business and themselves. And actually, some leaders did this really well. Brian Chesky talked about this constraint and the strains on it, but was thoughtful about how he would communicate to his employee base and his staff base. So there are others who not so well and, crashed in that. So we had leaders who talked about the cost of living crisis and found themselves talking to their staff, who they mentioned that they were also struggling because, the mortgage had changed, the mortgage rates had changed as a consequence of energy crisis, the invasion of Ukraine. And they then lost empathy. They broke that trust, because this is a leader who probably earns, in excess of $1 million and gets bonuses. And you're talking to staff that earn not even a fraction of that. And so they were, in their attempt to try and empathize with their staff, they broke trust. They lost authenticity and people lost their belief in that leader. So leaders have struggled through a lot of change. And then we layer on the adoption and the rapid pace of adoption of AI. For many leaders, generationally, you're talking about those who are Gen Xers or boomers, born in a period where they've seen transition. They saw analog to digital, right? So they've got some reference back 30 years ago to that. They've also got some reference to geopolitical instability, such as, we talk about the Cold War. They've seen this before. But I think the difference now is that this technology, the rapid pace, the skills requirement and experience is totally different to anything they've got before, which is why someone like you and the CIOs and the CTOs in this business have become so important and are now, are the rock stars of these organizations, vital for their expertise to be able to guide leaders through it. But what I'm noticing is actually some organizations have forgotten everything that they've learned about leadership and have forgotten about the culture and the impact that change has on people's psychology. And so it's fracturing culture. It's creating silos. So CIOs, CTOs are finding themselves almost isolated from the rest of members of the executive team. And, no one's invested in how do you make sure you've got alignment of building bridges, building relationships and taking people with you. And that's a challenge. So we're seeing some CEOs saying, there were surveys talking about, AI is actually fracturing or tearing the business apart culturally, but we're being patted on the back by shareholders and or board because look at us, how cool are we? We've adapted rapidly and we're on it. So we're seeing a paradox, or we're seeing this division in organization. So that's some of the things I'm noticing.
Interesting. Some of these things are very interesting because while you were talking, I was reflecting on during COVID. I was in a Big Four consulting firm, and I'm not going to name them, but the diligence amongst us, I'm sure, can find out which one. And I remember they started this kind of, it was a good thing, right? So I'm not saying anything bad about them, but it was a good thing. They started this kind of keep in touch business as people moved remotely and the country went into lockdown. And not only the country, the world kind of went into lockdown. And what was happening was they were getting people to share, what is a day in your life? What does it look like? And the partner tier, of course, were dominating this. So they were sharing. And they were sharing, I get up at 6 and this is going to be very politically incorrect because I can't remember the terminology, but I get up at 6 and the maid has come in and already made breakfast, and I get on my Peloton and take a couple of calls. And this went on for a while, many weeks this went on, until eventually somebody who was an executive assistant had to go and shared her day. And she was like, I get up, I don't have anybody helping me. I make breakfast for the kids and try and get them off to school. I don't have a Peloton. And just the huge difference between the way she was talking about her day and the way every partner who'd gone before, because partners are the top tier in these consultancies. And they were all talking about this in a way that I couldn't relate to this. I don't have this kind of lifestyle. This is the ultra rich talking about their working day. And when this EA came on and said, this is my day, and she made a very big point about, I don't have this stuff. This is vastly beyond my reach. And that demonstrated a kind of, I wouldn't have said it was a fracture in the culture, but it demonstrated that there was a difference between how people live and how people are coping with the lockdown. And it was good to hear that kind of reality. But the other thing that you said was around how cultures and organizations are coping with disruption. And I go back and forth on this because the reason I go back and forth is that there's always this temptation to say we're going to need to take everybody with us on the technological transformation journey that every company and organization and even society is going to go through. But the reason I go back and forth on this is on the flip side, there is going to be a very different workforce. If you do this right, there's going to be a different workforce. And we're at the level right now, we have been for a while, to be honest, where the capability of the machine is more than the mean and the normal distribution in most attributes, which means that a lot of things we don't really need people to do. And there are a lot of things that we have been doing historically where these things will be automated. So the workforce itself needs to be different. And if the workforce itself needs to be different, then the thing that I got back and forth on is how much do we need to take a workforce on a journey that isn't going to exist versus how much do we need to be finding the new workforce and architecting that journey with them. These are two different things, and culture is going to need to change in a business. What do you think about that?
So I completely agree. And the problem we have, Ashwin, is that probably 8 years ago, we were talking about exactly this, right? We were talking about the advent of what AI could bring. And there were insightful reports being written about how education institutions need to be thinking about that now, how we need to change what children are learning. And to some extent, some schools changed, right? They started helping children to learn to code. But not rapidly enough, but some did. And then not enough colleges said, what does it actually mean to be a software developer, AI engineer, and what do you need for those things, and double down on that. Government have been 8-10 years too late in their focus on what does it mean for our economy? How do we build the infrastructure to do this? So to a certain extent, we're playing catch up. Every institution and infrastructure that needs to address cultural change and this level of disruption is just 8 to 10 years too late in preparing us for it. Because so many people say, well, this is just a bit like Ford, when Ford invented, the car, rolled off, and we had, mechanics, and we had to, which didn't exist because we had people driving horse and cars. I get the analogy, and I understand the Industrial Revolution analogy and analysis of the impact that technological change has had on countries, societies, communities, companies. What I think is problematic today, and what I think is different to those times, is that this is much more rapid. This is much more rapid in its adoption in cultures. So the point is that the regret arises when we're making decisions so fast that the people that we actually do need to take on the journey with us, we've lost because we've laid them off. And then we realize actually we need their experience to train and work with our agents and our AI bots to ensure that the institutional knowledge, the expertise that has been gained has been captured, because the LLM is historic. Like, some of these guys have not put that level of experience and expertise into the LLMs. They don't exist. And so we've got regret, because these are people who actually could have worked alongside. And yes, the issue is, are their turkeys voting for Christmas? But the fact is that actually they will evolve with it, and we will get far better systems and organizations culturally by ensuring we're communicating really well. We understand, we don't make rapid decisions from a gunslinger perspective, shotgun approach, that we're really thinking about every aspect of it. But what we're doing is operating on a short-term perspective, quarter to quarter. And that's the reason why, there is regret around friction and fractures in an organization. There's a way in which you can communicate that ensures that you are sowing the seeds of good karma, and you are ensuring that people are leaving, but leaving with a package, with training, with options, and a future. And certain companies do think that way. They do think about how they help others to move on, or how they help to retrain. So many people are talking about AI literacy. Not many of them are actually training their workforce, or certainly certain generations, their workforce, how to work with it. They're just saying, play around with it on the side of your day job, versus constructively creating the right kind of prompt libraries, the right kind of curiosity and critical thinking to ensure that what it produces for you has come from credible sources and is not made up, and it's not hallucinating in the way that, lawyers have been caught out in court, others have been caught out with relying on non-existent, false or fake evidence or data.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting stuff. And just, quick plug, I have an AI literacy readiness and data literacy platform, AI Chrysalis. Have a look. I have a look on my website as well, methodology.com. Many, many frameworks around this stuff, which are pretty much applicable to every aspect of the workforce. But I agree with the kind of sentiment that if you're going to take something seriously, it can't really be side of desk. It has to be focused on. It has to be deliberate. It has to be invested in. There has to be time for this stuff. I think time poverty has been endemic for certainly 10 years of my career, but across nearly everything that I've seen. Encouraging people to do things side of the desk is not going to be purposeful. I agree with that. Where do you think, because you mentioned prompting, and certainly in the last 2-3 years, I've seen prompting go from the next big thing to virtually non-existent or not important. And the reason for that is twofold. So the first reason is most technologies now are building in prompting as part of the technology. So, you ask a very rudimentary question and the prompt will be enhanced automatically as you go through. The other side of this is whether we're talking about prompts or whether we're talking about Google searches or whether we're talking about people talking to other people, clients interacting with developers and trying to say, this is what I want, and developers then interpreting that as something else. Even graphic designers, developer could be a very broad term. It could be a construction worker working on your house, whatever it is. You've got people talking in different languages. You've got people, and I don't mean like actually different languages, I mean just different technical languages. And people's inability to articulate a query is something that I've observed throughout the entirety of my career, certainly, that people just can't ask a question well. And if we didn't expect folks to be able to ask Google 10 years ago for something and get a reasonable answer out, why would we now expect, without some kind of purposeful intervention, that they would be able to interrogate an AI model and get something meaningful out? And most of what I'm observing in companies is that many companies, and if you're watching this and you're thinking, you're feeling personally attacked, yes, this is for you. Many companies are still on this journey where they say, we're going to give every person, or just the select few, because, we have privilege, we're going to give the select few access to something like Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. And we're going to say, there you go. Off you run, you little scamp. Go and find out what it is that you're going to use it for. And this is, to some degree, the most rudimentary and basic way to use artificial intelligence without thinking of agents, assistants, workflows, automations. All of these things are way more powerful. But also, having this grassroots-led kind of use case is only half of the equation, because you also need to figure out what the tangible and measurable business problems are and where you would apply a technology where the solution fits the problem, and then do that in a way that's measurable and purposeful. These kinds of things are where I see organizations kind of getting this wrong. It does, to some degree, stem from, you mentioned right at the start, this idea of leaders having the courage to follow through on a vision, whether or not they have complete information. And I think a lot of companies are taking the easy route at the moment, where they're saying, you know what, we're already in a Microsoft environment, we're just going to implement Copilot, and now we've done AI. It's done. It's fine. So,
and that so resonates with what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. I think the big challenge is exactly as you described. The fact is that they're not intentional about it. And, earlier on you talked about burnout. I think when we look at the way that people are working, and COVID was both a blessing and a curse. The lockdown period meant that people were at home, and of course we saw productivity hypes, but actually they found a way to integrate working life, balancing it with some family. Sometimes that was hellish because you were helping children do homework, and exercise, and family dinners. So the thing is that the intentionality of AI adoption needs proper case studies and people working on it. Now, when we're rapidly working 12-hour days, how do you find the side job, the spare hour or so to play with it, do something constructive, and actually that has an output that is of a benefit to the business? And I recall talking to even younger members of my team and said, let's look at what you do. Let's lay out how are you managing this work. And it didn't occur to them. They were performative. They were being directed because they were junior, they were learning. They were being directed, do this. This is your job for the day. Answer this mail that comes into this mailbox about intellectual property or trademark registrations or whatever it is. And they would be repeating the same thing over and again, ripe for automation. But they're not thinking about it because the cult of busyness kept them so busy that they didn't give themselves the space or the curiosity to say, I think we could do this differently. And I think we could automate this and standardize this and make this accessible here. and train a bot to be able to answer these standard queries based on what we've done historically. And it takes a leader to say, let's create a marketplace for ideas. Let's create opportunity to disrupt ourselves. And that's a good thing. We should reward it. And we should reward our focus on efficiency, and not to fill it with other things, but to give ourselves space and a better balanced day so that we could look after our health, actually have time out of work, so we weren't living in it every single day, and that actually we were utilizing the time to recover and recuperate from an intense day. And I think that's part and parcel of the thinking, is that with the efficiency gains, what are we going to do with that extra time? Well, there are many things that a business can do with that extra time that will lead to better talent retention, learning and development, growth, higher morale in their organization amongst their existing staff, because they're actually reinvesting that time in maybe more productive learning and development opportunities for individuals, and or they can do it to be more purposeful, connection with community, charitable giving, other things. Go and get yourself fitter so that when you come back, we've got longevity, your mind is sharper. I want you to take that time to actually look after yourself so that you come back, your brain's grown, you've relaxed, your creativity is better, and actually you've come back to a job that you can focus your mind on that requires your experience, expertise, critical thinking. The risk is that those who are using it in the day-to-day, and we're naturally lazy as human beings, we're going to render ourselves moronic. And the study that when you and I are talking previously, there's a study that showed since 2007 that our literacy and numeracy has declined in the last 7 years and continues to decline. So we're losing the ability to do complex thinking because we're choosing the rapid use of AI to do that for us. And it has a distinct impact on certain professions. The legal profession's a very good example of that. And that's where, how do you teach some of the things that you learn through error, through failure, through human interactions, and physically being together and observing behaviors, people operating in discomfort, people operating in challenging situations. If all we're doing is simply saying, we're going to replace the junior staff, we're going to stop hiring graduates, we're going to narrow it down, we're only going to take those who are literate, everything else goes out the window. Then you've got people talking about, how do we create AI simulation to replicate what we've just said we're not going to do anymore? Because that's a vital part of learning to get them to the next level of seniority or next level of expertise. They need to go through that AI simulation in some form or another. So we're artificially creating experience because we've just got rid of all of that experience, not realizing we still need to think about the experience and expertise to get people to the level that the Generation Xers, the leaders, the bosses, the MDs, the CEOs are at the moment. So we're just not applying critical thinking and our own intelligence to this. We're responding to pressure. We're rapidly dealing with short-term goals as a prize to demonstrate we've got, productivity, which we do have in some cases, well-adapted companies. We've got efficiency. We've got better deliverables, speed to cash, speed to money, and we can talk about it outwardly that increases our share price or increases the kudos of our company. Short term.
It may be short term, but I'm going to take a contrary approach just for, to stimulate the discussion a little bit. Now, if we think about a company that has endless money, right? There's no bottom to the bucket. It just keeps going. Of course, they can pursue certain things that companies who are less rich can do. And I remember a while ago, I was looking at the World Value Survey. Many years ago, I was looking at this. Now, the World Value Survey is a snapshot that's taken every few years of nearly every country in the world, what their values are. It's a huge survey. And they were looking at this, and they've been doing this for, I think, 40 years or so. And they were looking at this, and they said, well, actually, over time, what happens is that as countries, as societies get more wealthy, they become economically better off, and they have all the trappings of that, better education, better healthcare, and all this stuff, that they become more liberal. They start to tend towards the kinds of things where we say, well, what about self-actualization? What about being the best that you can be? What about making sure that equality and all of these things are in place? And these are reversible trends, because as economic shock hits and societies become poorer, then they tend towards conservatism, they tend towards in-group, out-group psychology, and they tend towards exclusionary thinking. And if we apply that kind of thing to what you've been saying, that what we should be doing is saying, and I've said this before on other podcasts and snapshots and sound bites, and I'll say it again, is that if I've got a team of 10 people and I can automate 80% of the workload of everybody, am I going to have lots of people who are going to be doing profound creative thinking and innovation, or am I going to have a team of 2 people? Business is capitalist, so probably those people are going to go. And this is true of, I think, most businesses at the moment, because the economic conditions are such that businesses are looking at efficiency, businesses are looking at revenue, and they're looking at shareholder value and all of these things that we've described. So is it likely that businesses are going to be positioning themselves towards what you've described? We want to train up individuals. We want to make sure that they're productive in society. We want to invest in creativity and all of these things. Or are they likely to go the other way? Now, there's a short-term and long-term view of this. Now, the long-term view should be that we want human and machine to work synergistically to produce maximum economic growth. The short-term view is going to be, what do we need to report to shareholders in the next quarter? So these things are going to be,
and
like this.
With long-term sustainable vision for a business, the most courageous leaders are the ones that have focused on what does it mean for the future? What does it mean for our talent? If I get rid of 8 out of the 10, I may have lost the opportunity to actually have and harness creativity and ideas for the future. Because, of course, our large language models are all based on everything that's already happened, not always accurate. And so we've left the last 2 to think exclusively on their own without the introduction of, cognitive diversity, which is rapid and required for future thinking, for evolution. And human creativity needs that kind of interaction. We all know that for innovation to happen, we need constraint. And constraint comes in the form of resource. It comes in the form of lack of cash. It comes in the form of a cause bigger than ourselves that puts pressure on us to come up with creative ideas. Still believe that AI is still nascent enough at this stage not to be nearly as creative as the human mind. And it is not going to be able to, especially if you're a consumer-facing business that needs to understand behavior of your consumer base, it's not going to nearly be able to understand that behavior as well as a human and interact with them. I mean, if we look at just an example like Klarna, Klarna made 700 people in their various centers redundant, only to recognize that the bots could not actually deal with the customer services and complaints went up. And that's the kind of rapid decision making that we're doing to appease the gods of, wealth creation, profit, shareholder activism, etc., that puts pressure on us to get there and to create competitive advantage and to be ahead of the pack. But actually the regret comes as a result of acting too fast and not thinking through all of the scenarios and testing it. And I do subscribe to the, Reid Hoffmans of the world who say, if you are looking for perfection, you've left it too late to launch. You've got to learn on the go. So I'm not saying strive for perfection. I'm saying understand the constraints, but realize that actually companies today attract and keep talent, and they're going to want to keep talent, attract them because they are a holistic business that thinks long-term sustainable. And actually, maybe it's still unpopular as a consequence of cultural shifts, but are thinking about ESG, are thinking about diversity, are thinking about actually being a destination employer that you can enjoy, be loyal to, and recommend to other people. And those things still matter to talented individuals. And when we look at generational divides, the generations of millennials and Gen Zers care about those businesses, care about businesses that have a relationship with society or a purpose that they can put themselves behind. People, they will want to say, great, I can do this job with my eyes shut, but I still want work-life integration. So I want the ability to switch off and go running, yoga, walk my dog. I want an organization that I feel is going to fulfill its purpose in more than one way. Yes, a commercial, strategic, business that does what it's being built to do. but also cares about the environment, its footprint, and about its people. And I'm going to vote on that basis. And there's a significant number of surveys and studies that say that's the choice that some of the most talented individuals are going to make with their expertise. But that's the generation that we are saying are the most digital native, most at ease with it, but they still care about growth. They still care about learning. But they are the most disrupted generation because of COVID, which has led to higher incidence of mental health issues, higher incidence of burnout. And yes, we hear clickbait headlines saying they lack grit. But when you look at the conditions in which they grew up, the impact of this technology has greater impact on their cognitive abilities. And that's leading to fatigue faster. Older generations recognize some of that, but actually it's taking a lot longer for us to realize actually the fatigue I feel is not my hours. It's the interaction with technology because I'm always on. My senses are being exhausted and depleted through the multiple screens that I'm operating on. The fact that my phone is always at the end of my hand and I'm taking no time to replenish, re-energize, and or just the joy of having a laugh with my mates or the joy of building relationship with colleagues and learning and being stretched in a way that can only come from those who have expertise and who are older than I am. And I take time to listen and be curious about that and build relationship. So companies aren't thinking about multi-generational workforces or creating a marketplace that allows innovation to happen. And if they're not thinking about sustainability long term, both in terms of their business, how is my brand going to last in the next 30 years? And what do we stand for? How are we going to respond to energy crisis, water crisis, data centers that we know need cooling? And so we still need to be thinking sustainably. And for us to last the next 30 years, especially with shareholders who've got a 30 to 50-year window of investment, if that's their investment thesis, then some of those shareholders are going to care about your footprint and how you're thinking about longevity and where you are locating your data centers, where your talent's going to come from in the future, and what you're doing to make sure they are being trained and retained, and that you're not got this churn constantly and therefore losing that expertise, that institutional knowledge that you need. So I think those things are connected really to a overall vision for what a business should be today and in the future.
It's predicated on two assumptions, though.
Mm-hmm.
Assumption one is back to what I said about normal distribution. I think a lot of what you've said, I agree with. If we apply it to top performers, if we apply it to the population as a whole, I would disagree, because the population as a whole, if we're talking about critical thinking, for example, you have a population, you're going to have a mean value where this is on average what people can do when it comes to critical thinking. And then you have a distribution, and our top critical thinkers are going to be able to do the things that you've mentioned. They're going to be able to apply themselves in ways that others can't. The people who are able to think critically or creatively, because you mentioned creativity as well, and are machines as creative as people, well, they're not as creative as the top performers, but we have a line, and we have a bunch of people who are unable to be as creative as a machine. So I think distribution is very important, and we nearly always ignore the point of population distribution when it comes to these kinds of debates. But the other assumption there is that buyers versus sellers market, right? In a job market where there aren't that many jobs, people are being let go all the time, then I don't think this point about, people are going to choose companies that have values that align with theirs, and all of this stuff is soft. There's going to be a hard reality, and that is there aren't that many jobs. If you're looking for a job, you're going to go for a job that pays you money that you can pay the bills with. And these two perspectives are going to be in competition nearly all the time. I don't think we're seeing more jobs being created. I think we're seeing a crunch in the market. So the softer side of this, where you say, I'll choose a company that aligns with my values. No, you'll choose whatever company gives you a job, because there aren't that many jobs. So I can see that some of this stuff's going to go away short term. Long term, of course, who knows, right?
Yeah, I think long term, economy and government are going to have, and businesses are going to have a problem, because if with the rapid pace of layoffs, who's going to have the money to buy the products being created, right, and consumed en masse? Who's going to have the cash to do the casual leisure related? No one's going to have that. people are going to double down, and government's going to have an enormous problem with addressing that. And we have historical examples that we can look to. When everyone talks about this, they always talk about Jonestown in the US, right? The mining companies came in, and then rapid automation led to decades of individuals who were unemployed and decimated a community and families and created long-term poverty. Now, without investment, without us learning from history, we are never going to really truly understand what responsibility organizations, companies, society has to individuals, and to build more sustainable models that make a difference long term. But I think that the current example of cautionary tales like Klarna or regrets, I think there was an Adecco had done in May, I think it was, they did a survey of leaders who found that at least only 10% of their staff were really future ready. The rest weren't. And so they weren't looking at how do we get our employees future ready and to be able to cope with disruption. They were simply saying, okay, we hadn't thought about how we upskill them, and actually growth is going to lead to having more employees who are upskilled and able to adapt to the revolving and evolving change. If we have mass layoffs with individuals who are not upskilled and there's no option, they don't get the money to reskill, they don't get the institutions that are able to change what they're offering in terms of courses to help them upskill, we're going to have a significant problem. And I think, what we've seen a decade ago is that business stepped in where government failed. Where government was withdrawing funding in societies, business stepped in. And actually, they're the ones that had the best relationships with communities and longevity and the best brand association, the best brand uplifts. And that mattered. That's the evidence for saying why you need to have a better strategy that involves relationship with your planet, your communities, the customers you serve, to replicate who they are. And there are companies that need to ensure that their own employees understand the consumers they serve. And AI is not necessarily going to do that in isolation. The data has got to come from humans participating in surveys, behaviors being observed, taken down, and individuals having empathy for, a position a consumer finds themselves in. So the human behavioral aspects are still going to be needed to be taken into account when decisions are being made on strategy, especially if a business cares about it being around in 30 years. What is the long-term sustainable vision for a business? One that's inspiring, but one that has a relationship with society, with the planet, and cares, because it's not going to be around if suddenly we run out of water. It's not going to be around if the land that its data centers are on is overtaken by a corrupt government.
So yes, I agree with a lot of that stuff. We are at time, so I'm going to wrap this up. We could talk for hours. I feel that we could.
Well, we are raving
really
on all sorts.
No, it's really, really enjoyable. So Nilema, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ashwin.
I will wrap up by saying, if you're watching this, don't forget to follow the clips on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, see us on LinkedIn. The full episodes will be on YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and they'll be on Spotify. Don't forget to follow, and stay tuned for more episodes.